This next part is titled Atlantis and Lemuria. This is the second half of the Emerald Tablets of Thoth by Dr. Doreal. I read through the tablets already and posted them on YouTube on a couple different channels. And again, this is the last half of the book. So after you read Doreal's translations, he adds all this extra info, all this commentary, and his interpretations also. So that's the second half of this book, which I just started going through right now. So this next part is entitled Atlantis and Lemuria. In legend, it is said that there once existed in the Atlantic Ocean a great race who lived on a continent or group of islands, which now have as the sole remaining part above water the Azores Island. The group of islands were called Atlantis, from which name our Atlantic Ocean was derived. Modern historical records only go back some 5,000 or 6,000 years. According to the chronology as given in the Bible, the world was created only a little over 5,000 years ago. I have read manuscripts, which were written a lot earlier than that, and I am convinced that our world has existed for many more than 5,000 years. You know, if you read the ancient Sumerian stories, I mean, they've got these genealogy records and these kings lists dating back like 450,000 years. All right, let's continue. About the only record that we have of Atlantis is found in a dialogue by Timaeus, in the dialogue of Timaeus by Plato. In it, he tells his grandfather, in it, he tells that his grandfather heard from the Chaldean priests about a continent or group of islands which once existed in the Atlantic Ocean, and that the ancient Egyptians were immigrants or colonists. He says that there was a circle of water and then a land circle, then another mass of water and another land mass. He said that according to the legend of the ancient Egyptians, the god of the sea, who created Atlantis, had his place upon which he built a palace for a human woman who he loved, and that he surrounded this place by alternate circles of land and water, and that on these different circles he placed people, and that they were ruled by the sons of Neptune or Poseidon, the sea god, and this human woman. In the ancient Sumerian tablets, if I'm not mistaken, Poseidon is also Enki. They're talking about the same god in ancient Sumerian. They just called him Enki, and the Greeks called him Poseidon. According to Plato's dialogue by Timaeus, Atlantis was the home of all wisdom and culture, and we are even told that the gods of the ancient Greek or Roman mythology were nothing more or less than Atlantean kings or rulers, such as Atlas, who was an Atlantean. According to the Chaldeans, Atlantis had been destroyed in a great cataclysm some 10,000 years before their time. Then again, if we examine the legend of the Mayas in the South and Central America, we find, among other names, the people of Atlan, or children of Atlantis. We know also that they have many legends about the existence of a motherland from which their ancestors came. It is true that one of the Catholic bishops destroyed all the written records of the Mayas that he could get his hands on. Atlantis existed and was a great civilization. It was destroyed about 52,000 years ago. The Great Deluge mentioned in the Bible was the result of the sinking of the Atlantean and Lemurian continents. There are indications in South America of the existence of a great civilization. The Mayans today have a mathematical system which is far superior to that which is taught in our schools and colleges in America. Certain very fine calculations can be made from the Mayan mathematical system better than from our system. They also had considerable knowledge of architecture. Some people say they were not civilized because they did not use a wheel on carts, but used sledges instead. To the Mayans, the wheel symbolized a circle of light or infinity, and they would not use it for any material thing, believing it should not be desecrated. For that reason, they lack certain of the mechanical instruments which we have. The Greek alphabet from Alpha to Omega is nothing more than a collection of Mayan words which are the Atlantean origin, and in which is told the destruction of Atlantis and Lemuria. I refer you to Robert Ripley for confirmation of that. Our Christian Bible mentions the Great Deluge or Flood as having occurred a comparatively short time ago, whereas the records of the Chaldeans, from whom the Jewish people in Hebrew derived their knowledge of the flood, place the time at what would today be approximately 52,000 years ago. Our geologists tell us that there was a great shaking and subsidence of a great part of the Earth's surface some 50,000 years ago. In the Amazon Valley of South America, there are remnants of vast cities and works of such nature that only a great civilized race could have built them. You know, I visited some of those cities down in, and I posted some of the videos on my YouTubes also down when I went to Teotihuacan. I also went to some of the other ruins down there in like Central America, like the ones kind of near the Yucatan Peninsula, like by Cancun, Mexico, and then the ones by Mexico City is Teotihuacan. And there's tons of them down there. I mean, they're all through all those countries like Guatemala and Peru, and there's so many that haven't even been discovered yet that are just buried under the jungles down there. It is recorded that the Amazon Valley, through which the Amazon River now flows, was once a vast inland sea. And with the great sinking of the earth, the lands began to rise, and the Andes Mountains were pushed up, and the inland sea drained into the ocean. Thousands of feet up in the Andes Mountains today, there are still remnants of a vast civilization. They are of the hardest basalt and granite ever conceived of. One building still stands, and it is so eroded by time that every carving on it has entirely vanished. No archaeologist or scientist has ever attempted to explain that place, nor the origin of the great engineering work just outside of that ancient city, which is a canal large enough, wide enough, and originally deep enough for one of our biggest battleships to pass through. It is pushed up and goes over the mountains, and every few hundred feet it is broken and then goes on and up again. It was built before the Andes Mountains were raised up above the level plain, and when the mountains were pushed up, this canal was pushed up with them. It is there today and still to be seen. We also know that in 1872, when they opened up a mine there, they dug into the center of the hill and found a strange ship about 120 feet long. It had no sail, but it had a peculiar metal apparatus on it with strange lenses. When the air struck it, it fell into dust. I have it in my notes, a record of the exact date upon which it was found. That ship had been there perhaps 100,000 years. In Tibet, I have seen star maps which were up to 5 million years old. Man has been on this earth for a long time. Civilizations have risen and fallen. The North and the South Poles were once tropical countries. When we think of the antiquity of man and of the comparatively little that it is known in modern times about ancient man, we sometimes wonder if man, as he is today, is the degenerated descendant of the great man, or is he, man, going upward again? We might say yes and no on that. Atlantis existed and sank 52,000 years ago. At that time, The world was in a very barbarous state, with the exception of a few colonies which were left by the Atlanteans. Very little culture and civilization existed because the continent of Lemuria had been almost destroyed some 500 years before the sinking of Atlantis. There were numerous barbarous tribes in Africa, Asia, and in parts of North America. There were also certain great Atlantean colonies in certain parts of the world. One was Ireland. They have stories of the Tuatha Da Danann having strange powers now lost to man. Who lived there once and ruled man. They had powers to change their shape and take any form they wished to. If anyone displeased them, they could play a tune on a pipe and the person would disintegrate. That's describing like energy frequency technology. Play a tune on a pipe. That's like some kind of frequency generator that generates some kind of vibration that would just disintegrate you. Who are told that there came a time when they left their Ireland and went to some strange place of which they would not speak. But it was said that the time would come again when they would return. The Chaldeans had a perfect record that they had been civilized and had originated from an Atlantean colony. There is another Atlantean colony recorded in California beneath Mount Shasta, which is an extinct volcano. Mount Shasta was not a Lemurian colony. Atlantis existed for over 500,000 years. During that time, it was at the height of civilization and knowledge. They were developed and advanced in spiritual wisdom and unfoldment. Atlantis was a group of 10 islands ruled by 10 kings, which later in legend became 10 circles alternately of land and water. The Azores in the Atlantic Ocean are a mountain peak of one of the ancient Atlantean islands. The Atlanteans had developed to great heights of civilization. They had learned all there was to know about the laws of nature, and they had become so civilized that there was established an absolute and perfect brotherhood amongst them. There was no poverty. They had everything that would make for absolute, perfect material happiness. They had 10 islands and 10 rulers, and they had a ruler of all these islands. They had a philosophical caste and a scientific caste, but they learned that the use of material laws was only a stepping stone to the knowledge of the greater and higher laws. Finally, they became such a great spiritual race that the great ones among them began to pass closer to the spiritual sun, and their children were of a lower state of evolvement. They had great scientific powers and other vast powers at their beck and call, but they did not have the spiritual power to use them rightly. And it was when that happened that Atlantis was destroyed, because the people had begun to misuse the things which they had. It was destroyed so that the knowledge which they had could be removed from man. And when man incarnated again, it was in more barbarous races, and he had to begin again to climb the long ladder of life. So who was it that destroyed Atlantis then? It's my question. Now I will speak of Lemuria. It was closely associated with Atlantis. And in parentheses here it says, books to read: Atlantis Antediluvian by Donnelly, History of Atlantis by Lewis Spence. From Norway, every year there's a certain little rodent called a lemur, which leaves the land and begins to swim out into the ocean. It swims far out and then goes around and around in a circle and is finally drowned. It is an instinct the animal or the animal has to migrate to the land which must have once existed. Lemuria was in the Pacific Ocean. Its coastline lay off what is now the Malay Peninsula, and the only extant parts of its last landmass that are above the surface of the earth are the Caroline Islands in the South Pacific, and close to no large landmass except but the Malay Peninsula. They belong today to Japan. Before the World War, they belonged to Germany. For the last 25 years, no Americans were allowed to go there. The Japanese, in working there, found buried 100,000 coffins in pure platinum, and they are using this platinum to finance their war. They are called the Nan metal, or the Nan metal, and are composed of 12 islands forming an almost perfect rectangle. Every one is based solidly around with basalt. The walls that rise 40 feet high, and some of those stones in the walls weigh as much as 30 and 40 tons. The stones are fitted together with no mortar, and yet are solidly constructed that no seawater can pass through them. In some places there are steps leading up. Inside of the walls are the remnants of ancient temples. The Nan Metal and the surrounding islands are solidly covered with great buildings built of giant stones, in some of which are still some carvings. These buildings are so enormous that it has been estimated by competent archaeologists that the population of that area must have been somewhere between 4.5 and 5 million people. In other words, a city almost as large as London in an area of 2,000 square miles, where today there are less than 50,000 people, and today there is not enough land and food products raised in an area of 2,000 square miles to feed even a small part of the vast population which once must have inhabited the city. The Polynesians say that beneath one of the islands the sun god is sleeping, and that someday he will awaken again and rule the world as he once did before. It is said that the entrance to this underworld is found in the temple of the sun god. At certain times of the month when the moon is full, no Polynesian will approach, for during that time it is said that there comes up from below a sound of voices chanting, and there is a certain ritual, and if a person is on the island at that time, he is taken and never seen again. A number of white men have evidence that there is such a sound coming up from below. The 4 who have been known to stay during the full of the moon did not stay there the whole 3 nights. These Caroline Islands were known to the ancients as the mountain peaks of Lemuria, and on the mountain the great temples and city are built. You can see the mountain down as far as you can and look into the water, and divers have found buildings 150 feet down. It is said that once a city of more than 40 million people. We are told that it was from this particular place that the moon was born. The moon is a child of the earth. Before the earth became solidified as it was whirling around in space, it cast off part of itself, which became the moon. Many scientists believe that when that happened, it left a scar, a hollow space beneath, and this is the basis of legends of the underworld, with 8 entrances, and that there will come from there the Maitreya king of the world who will rule the world. When Lemuria existed above the surface of the world, it was a vast and wonderful country, and it had developed so far in science knowledge that it distributed the Atlanteans, who had turned toward the spiritual the Lemurians never had. They were a material nation. The Lemurians went further afield and established more colonies, And as a result, they had considerable trouble with the Atlanteans because in a few places where the Atlanteans had settled, the Lemurians came and there was trouble. These two nations existed side by side, one a great spiritual nation and the other a great material nation. Atlanteans had turned in their last days towards spiritual development, and the Lemurians had become very physical. The Lemurians were the Hitlers of their day. They worshipped the snake god. Before man came to Atlantis and Lemuria, these lands had been so inhabited by a race which was not human. It was a strange race, and that had the body of a man, but the head of a great serpent or snake. These beings were a hybrid manifestation, and they had hypnotic power and could cause the head to assume the form or even features of any person they desired. Again, this is sounding like the shape-shifting reptilians. There's tons and tons of reports and books and folklore and all stuff about these shape-shifting reptilians that are still here today, and a lot of them have taken on the shape of humans, and they've finagled their way into positions of power in the government, and that's one of the reasons why there's always wars and poverty and all these bad things happening, is because there's these reptilians, or these Dracos, some people call them, that are working with the government. These snake people were almost totally destroyed by the Atlanteans and the Lemurians, but finally, through centuries and thousands of years, they began to appear again among the Lemurians, and they established the worship of the snake and serpent. Through their power, they began to invade Atlantis, and they caused their serpent head to assume the form of Atlantean leaders. There we go, shape-shifting reptilians working their way into government. And it got so that the wise men of Atlantis searched out and discovered a word which the snake people could not pronounce. And every 6 months, the rulers of the people were called before the people and told to pronounce the word in which only human lips could pronounce. And thus the serpent worshippers would be revealed in their true light. The hypnotic illusionary power of the snake people is responsible for the legends which we now have for the little snake being able to hypnotize things. We are also told of a great temple on the islands of Atlantis, which was ruled by one great person or entity, who in those times was called the Lord of Lords, and that he had existed since before the beginning of Atlantis. He was alive when Atlantis had its beginning, and he was alive when Atlantis sank. He had manifested there for over 500,000 years, and he had power over all Atlantis, and was he who led the Atlanteans onward and upward into the great spiritual nation. When Atlantis passed, he went elsewhere, as did many of the great race. In my book, The Emerald Tablets, there is a translation of the life of a great one who left Atlantis when it sank and migrated to Egypt and founded the Egyptian race. This is Thoth, the builder of the Great Pyramid. Another thing about Lemuria, in Hawaii and among the Philippines, we have some record in the ancient writings of the Lemurian race, who left tablets and images on Easter Island that were built by the Lemurians. The great powers and mastery which the Atlanteans had of the laws beyond and above the material laws caused Lemuria to sink. But the deluge was not the great deluge. The great deluge was the sinking of Atlantis itself. When Lemuria sank, the ruling caste and the snake priests fled into a space which they had prepared for themselves tens of thousands of years, or for tens of thousands of years. It was a place from which the moon had been cast forth. The Lemurians had lived under the ground as much as they had lived over it. After the Lemurians had fled to that place, the Atlanteans sealed the entrance and placed a guard over it. The entrance is at the Sun Temple in the Caroline Islands. There is a story that from the top of Mount Shasta, periodically there is a great silver ship which flies over the Pacific. That ship goes to Nan Matal to inspect the seal where the Lemurians are imprisoned. Those souls who have not passed beyond the bondage of the wheel of life go to that place between incarnations and work to help bring the Lemurians to a state of spiritual consciousness to free them from their imprisonment. The Earth's surface has been changed 4 times in the past. Oklahoma and Texas were once part of the ocean. Mexico has been up and down 3 times. All right, so that was the end of that little chapter called Atlantis and Lemuria.